Thank you, and hello, Einat. And when we first met in 2007, we were both participating in the Jewish People's Policy Institute's colloquium on the challenges facing the Jewish people. One of the subjects we didn't discuss was a global pandemic. And I think we would all be interested if you could share some of your reflections on life in Israel in the light of COVID-19.
The JPPI recently sent me. We worked together on the Jewish people in 2030, and one of the scenarios that we put in was actually a global pandemic, although we didn't discuss it at the time, but it was one of the scenarios. This is really one of those cases where we're living through it. We do not yet know the implications. There's no doubt, and we're already seeing it, that it's exacting a significant toll, especially on Jews and many elderly Jews, certainly in some more Orthodox communities, but more broadly. In Israel, we've been pretty much what you've seen all around the world. I mean, one of the most remarkable things to come out of this is that there's no foreign news anywhere. You used to once listen to news that happened in other places, but now everywhere is the same. We're in a variations of some lockdown, social distancing, various restrictions. Like everyone, this is beginning to take an economic toll. In terms of the actual toll, we're doing generally fine. Relatively very few people have been lost to the pandemic. But the question really is going forward, because this is going to be with us at least a year before a solution is found that allows us to truly return to normal. So what we're doing here right now is probably what much of the world and the Jewish people are going to be doing for the coming months.
Thank you. Well, we hope that everybody does stay healthy. But one of the items of international news which actually has made it into Australia was the formation of a government in Israel. And with your experience in the Knesset, as a long-time expert observer of Israeli political life, would be most interested if you could discuss with us a little bit about your views of the challenges facing the new Israeli government and how well equipped they are to deal with them.
So certainly one of the first outcomes, political outcomes of the virus and the challenges it presents is that it probably gave the extra push to this emergency government, unity government, however you will call it, but government headed in many ways jointly by Benjamin Netanyahu and Benny Gantz. The existence of the pandemic, the economic consequences has been the extra element that pushed the sides to say, okay, we're not going to go into a fourth election. And despite the fact that a lot of people are going to be disappointed, certainly many of those who voted for Benny Gantz, for blue and white, and voted for him in order to replace Netanyahu, will be disappointed that he is now entering a government with Netanyahu. The pandemic has basically given the cover to say, look, those are extraordinary circumstances and we're moving ahead. But it's important to say that what we have, despite all the personal issues and animosities, is a government that represents a broad Israeli consensus. Rather than a unity government, I think it's best understood as a centrist government, maybe a center-right government. It's not really a unity government of two opposing ideologies like we had in the 80s, for the simple reason that there's no two opposing ideologies anymore. Certainly not on the key issue that used to be the dividing line of Israeli politics of left and right, of the Palestinians. So this new government, and we'll expand about it, but it's actually a government that reflects a broad consensus that has emerged in Israeli society in the last decade or two.
Okay. Before we get on to what unites, you were elected to the Knesset as a member of the Labour Party, a party which dominated Israeli politics for many years and now is barely represented within the Israeli parliament. Where to for the Israeli Labour Party, and question that goes along with that. Where did the voters go? Where are the people who are what we would call in Australia rusted on Labor voters? What are they now doing with their votes? How are they feeling represented within the Israeli political system?
So first, we're used to thinking of the Labour Party as a left-wing Labour Party because it was known for its labor and socialist policies, but also since the 1980s, it was known for its willingness to trade the land acquired in the Six-Day War in 1967 for peace under the formula known as Land for Peace. It was known as the Peace Camp. But if you look at the history of the Labour Party, it was always a very centrist party, and certainly in some of today's measures would be a considered even right-wing party. When the Labour Party was at its height, it was a very centrist party. So those centrist votes definitely went to blue and white. You could argue easily that for the last several elections, blue and white was the Labour Party. It was headed by a general, this was a mark of the Labour Party, that generals used to go to the Labour Party. So the generals went to blue and white. It represented the same sociology, the same demography, and it represented many of the same centrist views, also greater emphasis on maybe the secular nature of Israel. So in one way, you could say that's not a sad story. It's merely a story of renaming. The party that is named the Labour Party has just become a very marginal party that deals with social issues. And blue and white became the Labour Party, which is essentially a very large party, equal in size to Likud. So that's one way of looking at it, and it's very simple and actually reflects how voters voted in the last elections. The more ideological issue is that indeed the Labour Party, as the party that promoted the equation of land for peace, we can make peace with the Palestinians and the Arab world by handing over the land that we acquired as a result of the 1966 Day War. That ideology has come to an end, and essentially there's no political party now in Israel that makes that claim seriously.
In your forthcoming book, which we hope everybody here will not just read but also buy, The War of Return, you write of how you grew up believing that Israeli-Palestinian peace based on two states for two peoples was desirable and achievable. You talk about your later experiences, which caused you to recognize that this might not have been a realistic expectation. And I was wondering if you could just say a little bit about how you came personally to change your views.
Certainly, The War of Return, which is co-written by Adi Schwartz and myself, is a book written by two Israeli liberals, leftists. Every country has a different definition. But really, people, Adi and I, both grew up very much believing that this simple equation, this elegant idea of land for peace is the key. All we have to do is hand over the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, the Sinai Peninsula, and we will have peace. And for a while, it seemed to work beautifully. With Egypt, we negotiated an agreement, a peace agreement, by handing over the Sinai Peninsula. More than 40 days later, more than 40 years later, we can discuss whether really what we have with Egypt is properly peace. But at the time, we really celebrated it. And with Jordan, when Jordan did not have any territorial claims, we signed peace. And in the 90s, there was this sense of euphoria of, look, we're willing to hand over the West Bank and Gaza to the PLO, to the Palestinians, and peace is literally around the corner. And when Ehud Barak went in 2000 and to Camp David, which was very symbolic, the same place where we negotiated peace with Egypt, and he put on the table a proposal for a Palestinian state, an independent, fully independent Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, with a capital in East Jerusalem, including in the Old City. People by now forget how far-reaching the proposal was. Now, this was everything we grew up and were told that the Palestinians wanted. and that the day that the Palestinians will get it is the day we will have peace. And what happened is that they walked away from that. They walked away from a similar and even more far-reaching proposal in 2008 by Ehud Olmert. And people like Adi and myself began to ask, so what's going on? You could have had a state. Why are you not grabbing it? This is what a people who seek independence. You told us you wanted an end to the military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. So here, you could take it. Why not? And the fact that they walked away, and not just walked away, it was followed by this murderous campaign of exploding families, children in stores, in buses, in cafes. The message was basically, nope, what the Palestinians want is not a state. And Adi and I, independently and ultimately together, began to research what was going on. And like many Israelis from our political camp, the peace camp, we began to realize, and in the book, we show the process, we show the history, that from the Palestinian perspective, the conflict was never about how to divide the land between the Jewish people and the Arabs of the land, the Palestinians. From their perspective, and that has never changed, the Jews were foreign usurpers of a land to which they had no historical connection. And therefore, the only just outcome from the Palestinian perspective is no Israel, no Jewish sovereignty. And that explains their behavior. Whenever they were faced with a choice, as they were in 2000 with Ehud Barak, in 2008, not to talk about 1947, when they were told you can have an independent Arab-Palestinian state in part of the land, but the Jewish people, the Jewish nation will have an independent Jewish state in the other part of the land. To date, when faced with that choice, they said, nope, we prefer to continue fighting until the day when we have all of it from the river to the sea, Palestine.
Okay. Now, you're focused on the Palestinian demand for the right of return as the key problem for peace hopes. Could you just explain where that fits into Palestinian thinking, as you understand it, and why this is such a central barrier to the quest for peace?
So normally when people speak about the conflict and the issues, the things that immediately come to mind are the territory, the borders, the occupation, the settlements. These are all the issues that are related to land, to statehood. And sometimes the issue of the Palestinian refugees is mentioned, but generally it's considered a small issue, something that is a bargaining chip, and very few people understand it. Very few people understand why there are refugees. Why is it that from a war that happened in the 40s, we have millions of people who claim to be refugees from that war, by now into the 5th generation? That is not the situation in any other conflict, certainly not from the 40s, 50s, 60s. And there were many wars in the 40s and 50s and 60s with millions and tens of millions of refugees, and no one is a refugee today. So very few people understand why the Palestinians still claim to be refugees from that war. And very few people understand that this is the core issue. It's not a marginal issue. It's not secondary to the question of settlements or borders or occupation. It's the core issue because it reflects in their perspective the fact that the war of 1948 is not over. The reason that the Palestinians can still claim to be refugees from a war that ended more than 70 years ago is return, which is neither a right nor a return. There's no such right in international law. By now, it's not even a return. The vast majority of Palestinians who claim to return have never lived in the land. So it doesn't exist. It's entirely fictional. And it was made up in order to make it very clear that the war is not over. And this demand is equivalent to saying no Israel, no sovereignty for the Jewish people. Only when that is erased, only when the Palestinians return and the Jews become a minority in an Arab land, this is the proper situation, and then we can call the war over.
Okay. Now, directly tied into this is the establishment by the United Nations of an agency, the UNRWA, which is there to deal with the Palestinian refugees as refugees. Could you talk to us a little bit about the role UNRWA has been playing and also what, if anything, can be done about it?
So the subtitle of the book is how Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream has obstructed the path to peace. And much of the book speaks to that Western indulgence. And the symbol of the Western indulgence of the Palestinian dream that they will one day still undo Israel is the establishment of the still temporary agency called UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. Now, amazingly, this is still a temporary agency, which gets renewed every few years. And it was established as a temporary agency thinking that the refugees would be resettled in the Arab countries, as happened with all other refugees from other wars, where they got resettled in wherever they were, or they went to other countries, but they didn't return. That was not considered a proper response. The Arab countries with the Arab refugees had no intention of letting the war end, and they knew that the war would end if the refugees would be settled. So they insisted that this UNRWA agency, this temporary agency, which was funded by the West, initially by the US, by the UK, and later by all Western countries, will continue to exist and to feed and nurture the notion that Palestinians, even after the fifth generation, even when they are citizens of Jordan, are still refugees from Palestine. So UNRWA is basically the infrastructure, the organization, the agency that helps the West indulge the Palestinian maximalist vision and keep the conflict alive. And certainly our recommendations are in the book is that if anyone wants to ever have peace, the key step is to stop indulging the Palestinian dream. And one part, a key part, is to dismantle UNRWA.
Okay, UNRWA, though, is a huge bureaucracy. It has a great many employees, including Palestinians, of course. It services needs of Palestinians in the sense of education, food, employment, etc. How would you replace UNRWA? Who would take over that? Who would take over the roles that UNRWA currently has?
So indeed, it's important to remember that UNRWA, despite the name UN, is effectively a Palestinian organization. Almost all its employees, 30,000, are Palestinians, teachers, social workers. It is effectively the Palestinian social system for the Palestine from the river to the sea, kept in waiting for that moment. So it does deliver educational services, but it delivers them in the context of a Palestine from the river to the sea. So our argument is that the services of education and other healthcare for Palestinians can be provided by those in location, by the Palestinian Authority, for example, in the West Bank. This is one of the greatest absurdities, that under the Palestinian Authority, supposedly the Palestinian state, you have hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who are served educationally by UNRWA, basically sending the message that what? You are a Palestinian born and living in Ramallah, educated in a school that tells you that you're still a refugee from Palestine, but you were born and living in Ramallah. So which Palestine exactly are you a refugee from? The Palestinian knows the answer, Palestine from the river to the sea. The question, of course, is why Australia, why New Zealand are funding that. So the Palestinian Authority, which provides healthcare and educational services, can take them over. The government of Jordan, where 2.2 million so-called refugees live, despite being citizens of Jordan. Nowhere in the world are citizens of a country considered refugees from another country. That's not allowed to stand, except for the Palestinians. Jordan already serves the education and healthcare services of most Palestinians who are registered as refugees, so it's just a few more. In Syria and Lebanon, you have an agency called the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, who has been dealing with the refugees from the Syrian war. Why separate the actual refugees from the Syrian war from the not real refugees who live in Lebanon and Syria, who should probably be considered Syrian and Lebanese? So in the book, we offer very concrete proposals for replacing UNRWA services by the local governments, the local providers, in order to delink, to separate the actual services of education and healthcare from the political idea that the Palestinians are refugees from a Palestine that will one day replace Israel. That cannot be allowed to stand.
Okay, at this stage, I'd like to invite those who have questions to raise their hands, as indicated by Joel at the beginning, so that we can shortly move on from me asking the questions to you asking the questions. Just one last question from me before we go to the other participants, Einat. 2 weeks ago, members of the Gaza Youth Committee were arrested by Hamas authorities in Gaza for the terrible crime, it was called, of sharing experiences of their daily existences with Israelis. And my understanding is even their families have heard nothing about their fight. Now, these people were unambiguously nationalist. They believe that people-to-people contacts were in the Palestinian national interest, that's why they had them. They're a younger demographic, and do you see the emergence amongst younger Palestinians of a more pragmatic approach and perhaps even in acceptance that their fate is to live alongside Israel, not to replace Israel?
If such people exist, we do not yet hear them. Because the Palestinian ethos of return is the most central ethos to the Palestinian identity. For a new leadership to emerge that says the Jewish people are not foreigners in this land, they have a right to be, to have a state to self-determination in this land, no less than us. They are not foreigners, and therefore we need to divide and share the land with them. Such a leader, such a voice is yet to emerge. We have not even read one op-ed by a Palestinian leader or a youth person or a young person or a movement that says enough. Let's move on, as tens of millions of refugees have throughout the 20th century. Let's move on. Let's understand that the Jews are not foreigners, they're not usurpers, and we need to live next to them, not instead of them. Right now, there are no such leaders, and for us to encourage such voices, let alone leaders, we need to stop indulging the maximalist voices. And right now, what we have in the West is wall-to-wall indulgence, by and large, of the maximalist vision from the river to the sea. And as a result, no other voices that say enough, let's settle for only part of it. And it's important to say, when Palestinians say we support a two-state solution, but we also demand return, then the only two-state solution they agree to is an Arab state in the West Bank and Gaza and an Arab state to replace Israel. There is yet to emerge any op-ed writer, voice, youth movement, and of course no leader has yet emerged to say, we recognize the equal right of the Jewish people as a people and a nation to self-determination in part of the land, and we no longer wish to undo that.
Okay, thank you, Einat. Now to throw to the other participants, And the first question we have is from Sharon Mittelman. From Sharon. So shortly you will be brought into the conversation.
Hi, Einat. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm just wondering, there's been a lot of discussion about the cooperation between Israelis and Palestinians in relation to the coronavirus. Do you think that that might help to change anti-Israel perceptions from the Palestinians, kind of following on from Jeremy's comment about changing views?
So indeed, one of the things about the virus is that it doesn't care about who's Jewish, who's Arab, who's a Palestinian, who's Israeli. It does not recognize borders. And therefore, there has been very close cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, even with Hamas, to the point that there are even now discussions of a possible deal on the prisoners that Hamas has, on the hostages. So there are opportunities. It's important to know that certainly between the Palestinian Authority and Israel, there has been an ongoing, very strong security cooperation. This is, by the way, very typical of much of the relationship of the Arab world to Israel. I talked about the peace with Egypt. We have an official peace with Egypt. For decades, Egypt has been the strongest voice against Israel and various UN bodies, despite having a peace agreement. This is the Palestinian playbook. Cooperate with Israel on the ground, continue to vilify Israel in international bodies, in the media. This is still continuing. And there has been some pushback from Israel to say, we are not going to have this kind of cooperation and assistance on healthcare if you're going to keep vilifying us. So one can hope that it will change. The only sign we have is with Hamas willing to maybe open up the hostage deal. But something more profound, we'll have to wait some time to see if it changes.
Thank you. Next question comes from Marcus Rubenstein. Marcus, you were there. Great.
Jeremy, hello. Einat, thank you very much for your time. I guess one of the dynamics that we're expecting to change in Australia is a global dynamic insofar as the China-America situation and how Australia is positioned in that. I like to think of Australia as an Asian country, but our leaders think of us as a Western country located in Asia. That dynamic is going to change enormously, and I personally don't think necessarily for the better. But are you expecting that global dynamic to change appreciably, and how will that affect the way Israel interacts with the rest of the world, and also within the context of the Israeli-Palestinian issue?
So for already a decade now, Israel has been shifting its foreign policy. We have realized and noticed that America is eager to disentangle itself from the Middle East to the extent it can. It already started with President Obama with his pivots to Asia. But President Trump, despite what he says about President Obama, is actually continuing the same policy with a different architecture, but the same policy of trying to disentangle himself from the Middle East. So Israel recognized that quite a decade ago and has been already diversifying its foreign policy. We still are relying heavily on the US, but stronger relationships with Russia, stronger relationships with China, with Japan, with India. You've seen that. You've certainly seen Prime Minister Netanyahu. This has been very much his key foreign policy, to diversify Israel also into Latin America, into Africa. So we recognize that going forward, Israel will have to rely on a much more multilateral foreign policy, that it's not going to be just the US. It also has implications in the region. Israel is also building alliances with the Arab world. And if we're speaking about hope, that's where hope really resides. We've seen it. slowly building over the last decade with the so-called Arab Spring. As more and more Arab countries have their own concerns, the corona pandemic is certainly highlighting that. You're seeing that Arab countries really now are not concerned with the Palestinians. This was before the pandemic, but now it's even stronger. They see Israel increasingly as an ally, as a force for stability. I'm not sure I dare say yet a force for good, but certainly not a force for bad in the region. And for China, for example, this makes a difference. If the Arab world is not against Israel, we'll see if the oil still matters as much with the prices, but that means China can have stronger relations with Israel, Japan can have stronger relations with Israel, India, without expecting repercussions from the Arab world. So we're already seeing this new architecture of Israeli foreign policy emerging, and the pandemic is likely to accelerate that.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Gus Lira, Professor Gus Lira. Is Gus on screen? You are. Great, Gus. Your question, please.
Thank you. Am I unmuted?
You are.
Yeah, okay, good. Einat, I wanted to go back to what I saw as your central idea that has sort of characterized your migration from the left to the center, as you realize that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is not really about land at all. It's about the concept of the Jewish people as an interloper in the Middle East. So I have two questions. The first one is that somehow or other, the Palestinians have been extraordinarily successful in selling the idea of what they want to the Europeans. Now, is it that the Europeans have really been taken in by the Palestinians, or do they have some other reason why they support this delusional approach? And that's my first question. The second question is related to the answer you just gave. Is there an opportunity for Israel now to get some support from the Arab world to make a little place in the sun for itself in the Middle East, so that at least there is not a monolithic support for this right of return and so on?
So the Europeans and the Arabs are very much interlinked in their relationship. So Adi and I, in numerous meetings with European diplomats and journalists and policymakers, have been frustrated by their almost kind of strong refusal to accept that the Palestinians are agents of history. Sometimes we described it as a neo-colonial attitude. I even invented a word for it. I'm sure you know by now the word mansplaining, when men explain what a woman should think or has just said. So I've invented a word called westplaining, which is when Western journalists and diplomats explain away what Palestinians have just said. Because to the Palestinians' credit, they actually don't lie. They do speak in words that sound appealing, like justice and rights. But from their perspective, the justice is very clear. Justice means correcting the injustice, which is the existence of Israel. The rights they speak of is the right of return. It's not some kind of general right. But Europeans hear justice and rights, and they don't understand that when the Palestinians say from the river to the sea, they're serious about it. And we've heard from numerous European diplomats, oh, they don't mean it. It's just a bargaining chip. They know they're not returning. And we've always had to tell them, seriously, in this conflict, the Palestinian side is far more rational than the Jewish side. The Palestinians are looking at the map and they're saying, look, 7 million Jews struggling to survive amidst 500,000 Arabs, nearly 1.4 billion Muslims. This experiment
Okay, thank you. The next question we have is from Naomi Levin. Naomi.
after,
Oh, sorry. Are we back with Einat?
oh,
Sorry,
sure.
please.
But only after a lot of explanation and work, and it really requires Europeans to move away from this neo-colonial West-plaining attitude that refuses to actually take Palestinians at their word. It's very simple, just listen to what they say. Now, this is related to the Arab world because the tragedy we're facing, the irony you might call it, is that at the very moment when the Arab world is moving away from its blank rejection of the idea of Israel, unlike Palestinians, you are beginning to hear voices in the Arab world, in Saudi, in the Emirates, who are saying, why are we against the Jews being here? Islam has always favored it. Islam takes all three scriptures. The Jews belong here. They're not foreigners. You can actually hear those voices today. Certainly in the Gulf, you hear those voices. They do not fear, unlike the one in Hamas, they do not fear for their lives. They go on television, they write op-eds. And the tragedy is, at the moment when these voices are emerging in the Arab world, they're still not the dominant voices, but they're more prominent. The Europeans and the West are rushing in to keep saying, no, please do keep fighting. Do keep your maximalist visions of return. So for us, the key to peace is both the Arab world and the West need to stop indulging these Palestinian visions. And then once Palestinians understand the actual size of the conflict, that they're not the vanguard of Islam or the vanguard of the Arab world, that they're a small people on a small piece of land, the next day you can make peace. That becomes easy.
Thank you very much. And I'm glad we overcame that little technical glitch. Naomi Levin has our next question. Naomi.
Hi, Anna. Thank you very much so far. I just wanted to go back to UNRWA if we could. The Australian government currently provides $20 million in funding to UNRWA every year and maintains that supporting Palestinian refugees continues to be a priority for Australia. Can you give us some examples of how Australia could support Palestinians in a way other than providing funding to UNRWA as they continue to do?
Certainly. And one of our recommendations is that Western governments who want to help Palestinians, by all means, we're not against that. I mean, as far as we're concerned, Australia can double and triple its support if it wishes to. What we're saying is do not support the Palestinians in a way that indulges this vision of return and Palestine from the river to the sea. And as long as you do it through UNRWA, in effect, that's what you're doing. Also, to the previous questions, a lot of Europeans would like to maintain that the support to UNRWA, and I think this is also the position of the Australian government, is merely a humanitarian support. But if you listen to the Palestinians, again, if you don't have this neo-colonial attitude towards them, if you listen to what they say, they perceive the financial support of governments like Australia and European governments to UNRWA as political support for their right of return. And I think the Palestinians are correct. You cannot support a political organization like UNRWA for decades and argue that you're not supporting the political implications. So you can give the money directly to the Palestinian Authority. You can give the money directly to schools. You can give the money directly to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees to deal with Palestinian refugees in Lebanon and Syria. There are numerous alternative mechanisms, but the idea is whatever aid you give, make sure that it does not go through an organization like UNRWA that keeps alive the idea that Israel is temporary and that the Palestinians will one day return to an Arab Palestine from the river to the sea.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Steve Lieblich. Steve, are you on screen? Yes, you are. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Jeremy, and shalom, Einat. It's great to see you back in Perth, even on a Zoom screen. You said earlier on that the concept of land for peace is now accepted as not being a valid concept. However, in the negotiations between Netanyahu and Gantz, it seems that at least one of the major issues was the issue of asserting sovereignty in parts of the West Bank and the Jordan Valley in response to the US peace plan that's recently been released. And there's already experts drawing maps, for example. And my understanding is that while Netanyahu was keen to seize this opportunity and proceed as quickly as possible, and certainly before the November election, to assert sovereignty, a major issue put forward by Gantz was to delay that, to make it contingent on international agreement and on Arab agreement. So it seems to me that there is a reasonable proportion of the Israeli public that still clings on to this land for peace formula. Why do you think that is, and what should we do about that?
So I'm separating the question of land for peace from the question of what to do with especially our presence in the West Bank. The idea of land for peace, that Israel can hand over the land acquired in the Six-Day War, and in return it will get peace, that part, I think right now there's almost no political party that promotes, because given that Palestinians walked away from two perfectly good opportunities to have land and give peace, and followed it with this murderous campaign of suicide bombings, there are no Israelis who can credibly make the case to Israelis that if we hand over the land, we will get peace. So now, in many ways, this has become a domestic Israeli discussion with relationship to America and maybe some other countries. Meaning, okay, we're controlling this land. By now, I think there's a very broad consensus that Israel will remain in military control of the land. So from the west of the Jordan River, there will not be any other military force. I think that's definitely a consensus, both blue and white and Netanyahu and the broad Israeli public. And then the question is, okay, civilian authority. If the Israeli Defense Forces remains the only army to control the region, then what about the Palestinians? Israelis do not want to control the Palestinians' civic life. They certainly do not want to make them citizens of the state of Israel, because then the Jews would become a minority in an Arab state. And that to be a minority anywhere was certainly not our goal. Not for that we fought. So Israelis are stuck, and they're saying, okay, we cannot hand over the land to give peace, but we do not want to make the Palestinian citizens of Israel. We want them to have a measure of autonomy where they control their lives without risking our lives. And then it becomes a much more detailed discussion, because you see the parameters have now become very different. The Trump peace plan enters into that and says, okay, the Palestinians are going to have a state, but if you look at the state, it's effectively a civic autonomy. It doesn't have an army. Israel continues to control militarily. And then the discussion begins to be, how much of the land should we annex, and to what extent should we do it unilaterally or with American sanction or with European sanction? But those are very, very different discussions than we had in the 70s and 80s and 90s of land for peace versus greater Israel. That's why I said that all the political difficulties are hiding a broad consensus. And if this government, notice that this government might push away the settler movement, Yamina, and might keep away Meretz, but then pretty much have everyone else. Lieberman and Yesh Atid are not against those issues. So there's a very broad Israeli consensus that says, okay, how do we square the circle of not controlling the Palestinians' lives, not risking our own, but not having them citizens of a state of Israel? And ultimately, it then becomes a question of how to do it, with what international sanction. But that's a very, very different question that has governed our politics since the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Okay, thank you. And our next question comes from Svi Fleischer. Dr. Fleischer.
Hi, Einat. You've talked about a lot of serious issues Israel has to confront with respect to the Palestinians, and very interestingly. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your assessment, given what's happened over the last year, of Israeli politics and whether it's ready to deal with these issues. I mean, some people are saying Israeli politics looks, after 3 elections, no government for 17 months, very broken. Do you think Israeli politics is in good shape and ready to handle these issues, or does it need more reforms?
So there's no question that the last year has seen us go through probably our greatest political crisis since the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. I think we are now beginning to emerge from that crisis. We're not yet in the clear. And by and large, Israel's parliamentary electoral system, which has kept us through thick and thin, through all the wars, the waves of immigration, the waves of terrorism, as a parliamentary democracy, is holding. But we're not yet in the clear. I know that. But in terms of the issues that I discussed, this government, as much as perhaps I wanted a different one, for me, secular issues are very important. I wanted a more secular government. I did think that there was an interesting opportunity to begin to have a political partnership that did not exist in the past 70 years with Israel's Arab political parties. But despite the fact that I might have wanted a different configuration, I do have to concede that this government reflects the broad Israeli consensus. And there are many people who argue that politically, it's the best government you can have to deal with issues such as annexation and in many ways determining Israel's final borders. You can argue that beginning since the 1970s, Israel is in a process of determining its borders, because after 1949, no Arab government was willing to give us borders. They were only willing to give us ceasefire lines because, again, from their perspective, this was a temporary setback, which they will undo, which they tried and they failed. So with Egypt, we set our southern border, and with leaving Lebanon, we effectively established our northern border. And with the recognition of the Golan Heights, we're beginning to establish our northern border with Syria. And with the peace of Jordan, we've established some parts of our eastern borders. And with leaving Gaza, we've established that part of our border. And now the last piece of finalizing Israel's borders has to do with the Palestinians in the West Bank. And the way we handle the Trump peace plan will be around those issues. Do we annex 5%, 20%, 30%? For me, at least, the good thing is whatever we annex, that's going to be it. Because certainly Kushner is going to make sure, and Netanyahu too, and both in blue and white, they're going to make sure that there is at least passive Arab buy-in. So if there's going to be some buy-in for a 20% annexation, that's going to be it. Israel's settlement project, more than that, is not going to be continued. And effectively, those will be Israel's borders. So we're in that process. It's messy. In hindsight of 40 years, I can describe it as a clean process, but it's been messy. It wasn't always clear at the time. But we're going through this process, and what's on the table, a government which basically has the settler movement at the margins and has merits outside and has an opposition with an opposition that doesn't oppose that issue, is probably the best government you can have to deal with that specific issue.
Thank you. Now, before we go to the very last question, I want to thank you, Einat, for your incredible presentation tonight, your answering of our questions and your explanation of matters and your great promotion of the book we are all looking forward to buying and reading. I'd also like to thank the people who put this together technically, and also just tell people who are watching this on Zoom or Facebook, please, we want feedback. Please write to AIJAC. If you don't have another address, write to djones@aijac.org.au and I'll make sure it's addressed, because we really do want to know what you are thinking and how we can best bring information to you and help you get a fix on the issues of importance. But the last question, which does come from me, Einat, is if you were in charge of the next Israeli government or the new Israeli government, what steps would you be taking to bring about an eventual peace?
So if I were in charge of the Israeli government, I would focus on the issues that I am focusing on in the book and in my speaking, which is understand what the conflict is about, stop indulging the Palestinian idea that Israel is temporary, and try to create a coalition of Western countries, Asian countries, and Arab countries that are pressing and pressuring the Palestinians to say, we recognize the Jewish people as a people and a nation that has a deep connection to this land, a historical connection. They're not foreigners, and we are ready to discuss how to live side by side as equals, and we are done. We are done, and we have no interest in trying to undo the establishment of the State of Israel. For me, the idea of getting to peace is about understanding that the conflict is not about all the details that we're discussing ad nauseum, the settlements, the borders, the occupation, to understand that the Palestinians are actually not the small and weak party here. They view themselves as part of the Arab and Islamic world, and from that they take their strength. And only when that strength is gone and they deal with Israel in their real size can we have a true peace, which is based on the idea that there are two peoples on the land, both have a connection to it, neither is a foreigner, and both therefore have the right to be masters of their fate and to have a state of their own without risking and without demanding the others.
Well, thank you very much, Einat. We did have politicians listening. We had people in many different countries paying attention to what you said, and hopefully you will be listened to. We also would like to make a reminder, just want to remind everybody, we will be having other webinars very soon with Yossi Kuperwasser on Sunday week. And we also look forward very much to the next time we have the opportunity to be in conversation also with Einat Wilf. So thank you very much. Good night.